Good afternoon and welcome. This is ANZOG's NRCoP webinar on regulation and the creation of public value, exploring the 4 Ps. Probably in a room full of regulators, I should make my first sort of confession or caveat in case there's anyone from the ACCC watching, because it's been advertised as the 4 Ps, but we've got 5. We've had to substitute someone because of a commitment, but I can assure you the value of the product you're getting meet or exceeds what you've paid for to be a part of. So I am Grant Pink. I'm the Pracademic Advisor of NRCoP's National Steering Committee and the Manager of RECAP Consultants. I'm delighted to be here today to facilitate this event, which of course is no ordinary webinar. Not only do we have these 5 extraordinary panellists that are going to share their stories with us, it also marks the official launch of the ACT Chapter of the National Regulators Community of Practice. So what that means is all of us here in the ACT are really thrilled to join our colleagues around Australia in Victoria, New South Wales, Western Australia, South Australia and Queensland who've set up their own local chapters, which can leverage and really gain extra benefits from the national perspective, but with a local focus. And of course, this is a hybrid event, so we're live streaming for the first hour and we'll then take questions from the floor when that part is over. So when that finishes, those here will get a free lunch. Having said that, is there ever really such a thing? So if you hang around for lunch, you're going to have to hear a little bit more from me and a little bit more from Professor Ken Smith from ANZOG, who's here, and we can get down into the weeds a bit more about what our local chapter of the network and the community practice might be. So I would like to open the webinar by acknowledging First Nations people from all the countries, pay my respect to them. We honour their wisdom and their stewardship of the traditional lands, waters and customs which really do truly enrich us all. Now, before I introduce our speakers, a reminder about the webinars, the format of which we undertake. All webinars are recorded. In about 2 weeks, they'll be put up on the ANZOG website, YouTube channel. We'll be using the Q&A function, and really that's for the online people. Please put your questions in, upvote them, and then we'll get to as many as we can when we come to the Q&A portion. And of course, like every panel, we'll try to get to as many as we can, but usually the questions that you ask absolutely outstrip our capability and capacity. So, let me now tell you about these people. It is my privilege to provide you brief introductions of these panellists, and they will be brief, because we really want to get to the story, we want to hear their insights. They're all public people, they all work for government or an institution. You can stalk them on the website and find out a little bit more about them. But for now, for some context about their interventions, firstly, to my left, David Parker is the Chair and CEO of the Clean Energy Regulator. David was previously a Deputy Secretary in the Departments of Agriculture and Water Resources, the Department of Environment and the Commonwealth Treasury. So in those roles, David has qualifications in economics and law with a career spanning more than 25 years just with Treasury alone, and has worked on the financial sector, liberalisation, tax reform, macroeconomic forecasting and policy, competition policy, energy policy and international economic issues. David knows a bit about policy. He'll set us off right. Then we have further around to the left, Jackie Aegis. Jackie was appointed to the role of ACT Work Health and Safety Commissioner in April 2020. Now, Jackie is also Commissioner of the Labour Hire Licensing Scheme, and she's an experienced leader with extensive practice in both industrial and work health and safety laws. And, not surprisingly, in her role, Jackie is committed to improving the health and safety standards of workplaces around its jurisdiction. And I think as part of that, she believes this is achievable through having a strong regulatory response and keeping duty holders to account, which I think is central to the work of regulators. She's also previously been a Senior Industrial Officer with the Australian Education Union, ACT branch, and has also worked as a legal practitioner specialising in criminal law. So you can see the panel building. Then we're going to hear from Doris Cuban, who is the Executive Branch Manager Licensing and Registrations in Access Canberra, which is part of the ACT government, and Doris holds the statutory positions of ACT Commissioner for Fair Trading. So maybe that was a sound advice announcement that I made, but looks at also the transport licensing and compliance functions. So Doris comes with over 20 years experience, including working in regulatory enforcement and investigation roles, and is a very experienced executive who's worked across multiple agencies. We will then hear from Rona Mellor. Now, Rona is the Deputy Auditor General with the Australian National Audit Office, and Rona has previously held roles as Deputy Secretary for the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Human Services, and Rona has qualifications in law and extensive experience in the development and implementation of biosecurity, taxation and health system policies and projects, as well as large-scale operational environments. So that's really no surprise from someone who's looking at performance, you know, through the A&O lens. Last but not least, our special and unadvertised guest, our fifth P, is Professor Veronica Taylor. Now, Veronica is a Professor of Law and Regulation at the Australian National University here in Canberra, and in particular is associated with the School of Regulation and Global Governance, or widely known around the world as RegNet. She is the former Dean of ANU College of Asia and the Pacific and an ANU Public Policy Fellow and the designer of some of the university's education programs in regulation and governance. And her work, and when we say her work, we mean her research and her teachings, focuses on the professional practice of regulation, regulatory justice, rule of law, institutional reform and corporate governance. Wow, hey? So this is what we're going to do. We're going to go through policy, practice, professionalism, performance, and then the P, the fifth P, our protagonist will throw that into the mix. So really, thank you and welcome to our panellists. As I said, the plan is we'll go from left to right through the four Ps. I'll be asking the panellists to make an initial 3 to 4 minute sort of pitch or submission or heartfelt speech, interpretive dance, I don't know, but they've got about 4 minutes from that primary P lens. Okay, we know they blend and bleed across the four Ps, we know that, but we're asking them in the first instance to just go through their first P. So, over to you, David. Please tell us about the importance of regulatory policy.
Thank you so much for inviting me to come along today. It's a real privilege to be on the panel for the launch of the Community of Practice. And it's a lovely topic, isn't it? Regulation and the creation of public value. I think that's terrific. So I'm going to talk about the policy bit of it. So I am a regulator at the moment. Prior to that, I was mostly in the policy world. So the story about the bleed is really important between policy and implementation. So I get the policy bit. So let's think very quickly, set the framework up, go back to first principles. So what's government for, right? Okay. Well, broadly, it's there, and humans support it, because it orders society, right, away from the Hobbesian law of the jungle, right? And governments broadly use three tools if we go right back to first principles. So they spend money to do things, right? They spend money into society. They withdraw money, the second one, withdraw money from society, and we call that taxation, right? And they can do that in particular ways to influence what's going on. Obviously, spending influences what's going on, that's expenditure. And then the third big tool is to set and implement a set of rules about what can happen, what's allowed to happen, how things should happen, and we call that regulation. So I'm talking about regulation in the broad here, not a subordinate instrument to a legislative piece of law, but regulation in the broad, the setting and implementation of a set of rules. So sometimes when I talk about this, I like to play a little game. We won't have time for that today. Perhaps we can do that later. And the game is called You Are a Creature of Regulation. And the challenge is for people to name something they can choose to do which is not subject to, affected by, or influenced by regulation. So you've got time to think about that. We might play that over lunch. It's an interesting game, bit of fun. Sometimes regulation sounds dry, but we'll get to a fun bit through playing that game. So the creation of value. So obviously we don't live in a Hobbesian world of the rule of the jungle. Thank heavens for that. But let's just point out a couple of things right here and now. This building would not exist were it not for regulation. We know it's safe. We know the air inside is clean. There's no asbestos around, all that kind of stuff. The electricity of the lights, which is shining in our eyes, would not be there but for regulation, which creates markets. So regulation broadly allows complex transactions to occur, which otherwise wouldn't be able to occur. So that's how it creates value. Two little examples. So basically it provides for trusted interactions between humans, right, which might otherwise not be able to occur, at least to the level of complexity that they do, right, and it creates markets, right. And of course, we could go on and on and on about where the value is created. Now, of course, if you speak to the business community, often you'll hear a story about wretched regulation. So much of it gets in the way. That's true too for regulation which is not done well or not fit for purpose. But underlying it, the iceberg under the surface is about value creation. So great topic. Great topic, Grant. Look, just a couple of things, observations from that, which then go into the subsequent things. So, look, as I get older and less certain about things, I've learnt that the world is a very messy place. It's very complicated. It's not simple, and humans are very interesting creatures, right? And in order for regulation, which is, can be written down and is often sort of black and white, in order to make that work in this world, you need judgment to be applied, right? Regulation needs to be responsive and flexible, and you need humans in there because they're dealing with humans. I have a rule in my agency as we automate that every decision assisted by a computer must go to a human. A couple of other things. Think about the purpose of regulation when you're implementing it. It's not just about standing there and I'm the regulator and I decide. You have to think about why you're doing it all the time. There's never a bright line between policy and implementation. They should inform and work off each other. And the last thing that I'd say, moving into the space beyond the policy bit, but being a regulator, right, is that you need to be a champion of culture because that aligns your organisation. A lot of people in the organisation down at lower levels, they're taking decisions which affect real people and have real effects. So you have to worry about the culture because that's how they take decisions. We've done a lot of work and we have now a purposive external policy statement which says what we aspire to be when we're dealing with external people and implementing regulation, and that is to be, there are four things: practical, right, not ivory tower; grounded, we know what's going on; purposive, right, quick, right. Don't muck around, don't admire problems, get on with it. And the last thing that we say, which is particular to our organisation, is to be commercially savvy. Right? So practical, grounded, quick and commercially savvy. Suits us, doesn't suit everyone. I was speaking to Enrico Palermo a little while back. He's the head of the new space agency and he wanted to steal my statement, and we agreed that grounded wouldn't work for him. And at that point, I'll stop and pass on.
Thanks so much. Thanks for kicking us off. Gosh, there's a lot in there. We could have a whole panel just on policy alone. David mentioned a few times about people and humans and practical application. So I think that's the throw to you, Jackie. Like, we've heard the policy story and setting. What is it on the ground? What does regulatory practice look like?
Thank you, and thank you, David. We are a Ngunnawal country. I pay my respects to the Ngunnawal people and elders, and I acknowledge the contribution the Ngunnawal people make to the health and safety of country. I agree with David. Policy must be connected and reflected in and by practice. Creating a strong safety culture in the ACT is one of my passions. Good policy is made and works best when it is informed by practice. The collaboration between the policy drafters and consultation with those impacted by the policy changes is key to successful policy. Policy designed in a vacuum is either completely unimplementable or requires significant time, resourcing and effort to implement. Regulatory practitioners are on the ground. We understand what works, we understand what doesn't work. We understand where the holes are and what tools we need to achieve the regulatory outcomes that will result in the regulatory goals that the government is seeking from us. We also know what is possible in terms of regulatory compliance and enforcement and regulatory practice. So I have a little example for you of when good policy is made through the collaboration of the regulator and the policy makers. In the ACT, we are about to implement or introduce regulations to strengthen protections for workers from exposure to silica dust or crystalline silica dust. The risk to workers from exposure to crystalline silica dust has been highlighted to WorkSafe ACT and to the government by unions, by industry, who all agree we must manage this risk in the ACT much better. WorkSafe formed a working group with industry who were able to conduct air monitoring tests on construction sites, which informed WorkSafe, so us and my agency, about the enormity of the issue in the construction industry. Through this working group, we wrote a guidance on managing silica dust exposure to workers in the construction industry. This document is the first of its kind in Australia. At the same time that we were doing this work, the Work Health and Safety Advisory Committee formed a crystalline silica dust subcommittee. The members of this committee were made up of unions, industry groups, me and the WHS policy arm of the ACT government. This working group had presentations from experts such as doctors and occupational hygienists. We looked at what other jurisdictions were doing, and we then made recommendations to the ACT government, which included the changes to the regulations. During the drafting period, the ACT government WHS policy arm have consulted extensively with WorkSafe ACT to ensure that we can implement the regulations. This has been a lengthy, time-consuming and extensive process, but it is worthwhile, as the result will be good policy which can be easily implemented, and it will achieve the regulatory intent, which is my regulatory goal, and that regulatory goal is to ensure that workers in the ACT and others are protected from the exposure to crystalline silica dust in our community. And hence, going back to David, why one of my passions is to ensure that the ACT has a strong safety culture. And I'll pass back to you, Grant.
We need a ball to throw around. Thank you. Wow. So we've got the policy setting. What Jackie made clear was that then has to be grounded and it has to be able to be implemented. So we now throw to you, Doris. So we've got the policy setting one end, but things happen on the ground, we need to be flexible and make it real. You're looking at it from the regulatory professional or regulatory professionalism lens. So what are some tips, traps, and you can share with us?
Thanks, Grant. Do I need to turn this thing? It's on? Oh, okay, there we go. I think as a starting point, thank you very much for being here today. It was not what I expected, but I'm here, so I appreciate that. I think as a starting point, it's critical to acknowledge that as regulators, we've been entrusted with significant statutory powers and authority to administer the set of rules, as mentioned by David. I think the other thing we need to be cognizant of is also as public servants, we have professional requirements and responsibilities, we have values and ethics to uphold in our public servant code of conduct. Then within our, regulatory functions as a statutory office holder or being delegated with functions, we need to also align those aspects and consider that in a professional context as people look at us and our roles through different lenses. These different roles and responsibilities link with key areas of regulatory professionalism, We have our decision-making components, our discretion, and those range of delegations. And integrity is also incredibly vital to all of the work that we do. I think there's an importance of being a credible and respected regulator and acknowledging that we can't please everybody. We're never going to please everybody in what we do, but we can perform our functions and roles with professionalism, recognising that the decisions that we make impact businesses, they impact individuals, and those are elements as a regulator that we need to be mindful of that whole time throughout the professional role that we take in what we do. So I think that's really just a very high-level summary from a professionalism perspective of our role as a regulator.
Thank you. And again, it gives us a great launch pad because, you know, Doris is talking about regulatory professionals. She's talking about regulatory professionalism and really how our performance is going to be judged. And, you know, enter stage left, the ANAO. Someone's going to come in and audit our performance.
Yep.
You know, we've told our once upon a time policy story, what we're trying to achieve. We've got some real on-ground issues. We're trying to be professional, but you come in and you audit it and you have a really close look. So what are your insights, Rona?
So I didn't bring my calculator or my clipboard. And I come to you as a person who, for most of my career, I was a regulator. So first met David in tax. And in line with the co-design, I just can't say enough about the regulator voice at the table. You've got to be able to do what the policy says. So having a voice at the regulation decision-making table around the policy is important. But I'm going to step up a bit from where David started with government, because I actually think that all the things that government does have to be approved by someone, and that's the Parliament. And it is the Parliament who approves the dollars and the movement of the dollars through the appropriation bills. And it's also the Parliament that approves the legislation that sets the enabling scope for your work. And so I want you to keep in mind all the time that the Parliament, the institution of the Parliament, is who you're serving. Yep, there's a government of the day, but at the end of the day, the Parliament passes the laws under which you execute your regulation. It gives you a privilege. It gives you power. I thought the game was today the most P's, so that's what I'm going for. And I guess you should therefore have a passion for the intent of that policy that they're giving you. The Parliament's giving you a policy, it's giving you legislation, you need to be passionate about it. Unfortunately, what we see, at least in the Commonwealth, is that regulation, we audit sort of 7 frames of government activity that Parliament gives powers for, and regulation is the second worst performing activity of government according to our work. So in that sense, we audit regulators, if you like, and do they achieve the purpose for which they are empowered? And most of the findings, so more than 50%, are negative. So you've got an opportunity and to learn from each other to do better. What we see is that people don't give enough thought to the powers that they have and the posture that they're going to take against those powers. So in setting up their framework, they basically don't give enough thought to risk. And what we hear, and we'll hear it from some of you in the room, oh, we don't get enough resources. We don't audit whether you get enough resources, we audit what you do with them. So the big key is when you look at the purpose and the intent that Parliament has given and the powers they've given you, have you actually thought about the distribution or the proportionality, there's another P, am I winning? The proportionality of your response to the risks that you're managing. You don't know if you're doing it if you can't prove it. So performance is about proving what you're doing to yourself as the agency, but also to the Parliament and the public and the people you're regulating. So you won't be successful if you don't set measures for your performance, not just at an activity level. That is important. Did we do enough of these? Did we resource them well? Were we efficient? All of those sorts of, you know, if I had my clipboard, down in the weeds kind of things. But the big performance issue is the outcome. Is my performance making a difference to the activity that Parliament has chosen to interfere with in daily life for the outcome that it wants? And that's where we see a lot missing in the regulator space. People count how many letters they send out and how many meetings they had and how many guidelines they issue. The key is, did they work? and whether or not did they work fits with the posture of your regulation. Posture is really important, as David said, about your people. I can remember days where there were compliance officers in tax who acted right outside the posture of the Commissioner. So when you're setting the posture, think about the posture of regulating externally, and are your staff on that same journey? Probity is really important too. When I was head of Aegis for 5 years, I don't know, I think I'm going to win. I don't know, there's one more to come. You know, we find that regulators generally have great stakeholder engagement. So they have roundtables and they have advisory groups and they work with business and industry. But at the end of the day, don't cross the line. Down in the weeds, everything you do as a leader, staff will see it as an invitation to do it at their level. So think about, when I was at Aegis, at Christmas time, the seafood importers used to drop off prawns and lobsters to the inspectors' areas. And we just had to stop them. You need to stop your staff, but you need to stop the industry doing things that compromise the probity of your regulation. Watch out for red tape reduction. It's sort of groovy. It's about proportionality. And one of the things we see is that people turn off the tap and they don't measure the impact that the red tape reduction has had. Has it let your regulated drift? Your performance measures need to be real and they need to be verifiable, not just for the Parliament and the public, but for you. As a manager of regulation, do you know what's happening and whether it's working? Publish it. Publish your performance. It has two big benefits. It's the transparency, obviously Parliament wants to know, but publishing your performance can be quite influential in persuading your market. So, I know, I'm going really well. If you publish the outcomes of your activities, your market knows you're there. So the presence in the market is actually important. We say in the audit office that just by being there, we have an impact. And we can measure it by when we start publishing what we're about to start auditing, people start cleaning things up. They go, oh, they're coming. The last P, partners in your profession. We see lots of entities being set up in the Commonwealth to regulate in new spaces. If you think about some of the problems there's been with vet training, and all these people set themselves up as approved vet trainers, took money off young people and didn't deliver the training. And so the Commonwealth responded with a regulator. What we find when some of those new regulators get set up is they don't talk to anyone. They don't talk to well-established regulators, not necessarily in the same field, but say to steal the posture, to steal it. You don't need to reinvent it. Steal it, amend it, and make it purposive for your business.
Well, I'm exhausted. I got up to about 13 or 14. I don't know who else. In a room full of regulators, I would hope people are making contemporaneous notes. That would be one comment I would say. But maybe the bookends that jumped out at me, which we'll definitely come back to, was power, our regulatory power, and that partnering. That, you know, from central casting, you're sitting right in front of the National Regulators Community of Practice banner. It is absolutely about partnering and learning from each other there. Now,
There was one missing.
I'm not counting prawns, no.
No. Okay. I'm just thinking about the P word, which describes my feelings when I get angry about not being able to implement policy.
There's a second word off. Is that what you? I don't know. I'm trying to be creative.
I think you're right.
Okay. Now, Veronica, we haven't rehearsed this because we're now coming to you. And what I'd like to do, I'm asking her in front of everyone, so this is going to be really interesting. You are the special guest, the protagonist. So this is what they've said about policy and practice and professionalism and performance. Well, Professor, you know, how are they tracking? So what I perhaps would invite you to do is if you wanted to make an initial observation about what you've gleaned from that will give me some time to look at the questions online, and we'll give you more time at the end to sort of do a wrap-up summary. So really just the first pass of, you know, their first draft of their assignment. How are they tracking?
So thanks very much. Great comments from all of the panellists. David, I was really struck by the way that you were positioning regulation as a third pillar of the purpose of government, but also the channel through which government is forming relationships with business and community. And so something we might come back to there is, how does that relationship look now in the context of post-COVID? How have expectations of government and regulators changed? What's our new social contract with regard to regulation? Because I think we can all observe quite a lot that's happening. And so your abstract sketch is great, and it's a really good framework. And now we need to colour it in a little bit more with the context and the temporal aspect of how we're tracking as a society. Jackie, I loved your passion for collaborative problem solving, and I think one of the things that you brought in really significantly was the way in which we define ourselves as regulators, not being prone to the risk of thinking that regulation equals government equals me, but the necessary process of creating consortia and problem-solving groups that draw in lots of stakeholders to solve what are often quite complex problems. And Doris, you pointed very carefully to the obligations of professionalism, ethics and codes of conduct. And I wonder to hear whether the expectations of professionalism have changed at a time when we are now coming out of a very long run of economic growth and prosperity. What does it look and feel like to be a small business owner in a moment of deep uncertainty, and what is the small business owner expecting from the professional regulator, and how might that be different now to what it might have been even 2 years ago? And Rona, I love your P's. I'm going to take your P's, in particular posture, which I love, and I'm going to raise you a couple of P's. So post-COVID is one, and of course, audit is concerned with checking against standards, looking for deficits, and thinking about how to cure those deficits. But I think something else we might want to be thinking about is auditing and celebrating excellence. So what I want to suggest is that we're here in the ACT, we're meeting at the beautiful National Arboretum on Ngunnawal country. One of the things that we might want to just reflect on is that the ACT itself is a pocket of regulatory excellence. We have the unusual circumstance of being a city-state with a very specific demographic, really close relationships and close proximity between the territory and the Commonwealth, a really high concentration of educated, thoughtful, but most importantly, responsive regulators. People across the world would love to have the quality of regulation that residents of the ACT enjoy and that radiates out across Australia. So as we audit and look for problems and performance and outcomes, we should also be celebrating the fact that we're starting with a pretty high bar. And it's good to have that ambition and to increase it. But I think today particularly is a good day to celebrate it.
So that could be partying.
Look, this is amazing. Like you'll hear from Professor Ken Smith shortly. For the event, we were down in Melbourne and we were doing a panel only 10 days or so ago, and it was the day after there'd been a debate on TV because there's something happening, on the weekend. So the panelists all wanted to debate, whereas now you're getting a sense that they're putting in their P's like they want you to vote. So we're not voting. We see you as a room full and an audience full of swing voters who are just here for the conversation and happy to learn. But yeah, I think let's not beat up on ourselves. There are successes, there is excellence, there is improvement, and we are making progress. And we haven't got an easy job, and we're often kicked around the place. So, the use of our powers comes to mind, not being able to satisfy everyone. What does it look like on the ground? Have we been successful? So they're doing okay. They're not going into the remedial class, are they? Like their initial thoughts are good. The first drafts of their papers are fine. We're really good. We're just asking you to polish and think about a few other things as you dive deeper. One thing I think you said at the start, David, you were talking about, you know, the ivory towers and all that, and we just wanted to make sure that wasn't a pejorative statement to our academic colleagues. But as we go back the other way, any sort of initial reactions to some of the extra information that you know, Veronica has amplified?
Oh well, look, I found myself furiously agreeing with all of the other panelists. So thank you, colleagues. One thing, Rona, I wanted to pick up is the sort of the measurement story, right? You know, have you achieved your purpose through the application? And I suspect that, you know, if you talk to any decent regulator, they'd furiously agree with you, right? But sometimes it's actually pretty hard to measure outcomes. So if I was to throw a further question to you, maybe that's why people count the number of letters and things like that, because, you know the old management adage, you know, what gets measured gets done. Have you got any sort of wisdom about what's a good way to measure the sort of the achievement of purpose?
So I'm going to speak to you as a regulator first, a person with, you know, maybe 30 years of regulatory experience.
Yeah, that'd be okay.
Okay. And then I'll talk about the learning from the auditing. So for senior people in regulation, you need to step back from what you're doing and think about how you will measure impact. And so one of the things that the tax office does is the tax gap. So it tries to measure, and it's pretty secretive about it because it's worried about whether its measurement's right and whatnot. But in their compliance activities, for example, they now talk about reducing the tax gap in market segments, because the whole bunch of activities that tax does, check your lodgement, data matches, send you a letter, pokes you here and there with a nudge technique, sends the auditors, all the things, all the regulatory suite it has, what it wants is to see that the amount of tax that's in the economy and the amount of tax that they're collecting, so the amount of tax that you can measure in the economy and the amount that people are returning and paying is narrowing, that gap is narrowing. The same thing in biosecurity. In biosecurity, we used to measure the leakage after the activities. So we used to check all the bags at the airports and all the cargo and all the incoming imports and all the mail, and then we would do leakage surveys. So did the activities that we applied to the risk result in everyone has a target, right? You're never going to get 100% compliance. So in the tolerance levels that you have, are you closing gaps? So I think turning your mind to, can you think about the behaviour that you're regulating and how much of it you're impacting, and find a measure. I know this is hard because I've had to do it and it's really hard. And I think it's a very intellectual discussion between boards and chairs and senior management and stakeholders, because the posture you take is going to determine how you close whatever gap it is or regulate whatever behaviour it is you have. From our perspective as auditors, what we're looking for is that you have that thinking in your performance statement. So everyone has to have a performance statement and you're supposed to put them in your annual report. We're now auditing those at a Commonwealth level, and we've done 3 entities twice now, and right now we're in DOR, the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment, because it is a regulator. It regulates environment, it regulates imports and exports, it regulates water, it regulates all sorts of things in different dimensions. And so we're looking for how have they, counting stuff is fine. Counting stuff is good because you can actually assure it and you know it's true and you can use it as evidence towards the impact. So is the policy outcome being achieved? The counting is not enough. And the Parliament, through the PGPA Act in the Commonwealth, has set rules about what are the characteristics of what you must measure, and outcome is one of them. So hopefully in the next year or so, we'll be giving more guidance on how to do that. But again, steal from each other. Some people will be doing it well already. I'd say tax has turned their mind to it. They've been there for 100 or so years. They've turned their mind to it a lot. Other long-term regulators may well have too.
Well, thank you for that. I think, do you want to go, Jackie?
Yeah, do you mind? Just to further that comment, WorkSafe ACT is a relatively new agency in the sense that we became an independent statutory authority on the 1st of July 2020. And one of the things that we have been doing is determining how it is that we measure our outcomes. We had, and the previous WorkSafe had been counting workplace visits, and we now we have a snapshot of data that we produce on our website, and it's every month it goes up on our website. But what we have this month added to that snapshot of data is not just the number of workplace visits we are doing, but to determine whether or not what we're doing is working, we're going to also have in our data the ratio of workplace visits to notices. And that will be able to inform us around whether or not what we are doing is working from a compliance enforcement perspective. So it's just, as you were speaking about that, go that one step extra. That's what we are currently looking at WorkSafe.
And I'm so pleased I'll let Jackie go first because it reinforced your point.
Do you mind if I just add one thing? Because I know you're all sitting there going, oh, who audits the auditor? You know, I know you're doing that. Deep down you're going, oh, what do they know? We have the same dilemma because we in our reports to Parliament, we make recommendations. So what we try to do is measure the implementation of the recommendations. Because one of our purposes is to improve public administration. It's not just to hold the executive government to account. And it's really tricky because we survey, so we audit implementation of recommendations. So every 2 years we pick someone, we see if they're doing it. What we find is a 20% optimism bias in that. So they say they've implemented something, we go and check and they haven't. We send out a survey to everyone who got recs in a year, and they all come back going, yep, implemented, yep, implemented. So in the measurement of what you're doing, think about the bias in the evidence that you get. There's bias when it's self-reported. We write it up as there's 90% of people said they implemented, but there's a 20% optimism bias in this. So our job is to start closing that gap.
Yep. Thank you. So what came to my mind when you were telling the first story about measurement was, I know the OECD about 10 years ago did a report, and even though it was environmentally framed, economic and social regulators can equally learn from it. And what they were saying was there are initial, intermediate and final outputs or measurements. And it's really, really hard for regulators to get to final outputs. So that's why the focus is on initial, how many inspections, and intermediate, how many prosecutions and change of culture. What I liked was maybe the third I, because you've got the P's covered, Rona, absolutely, was maybe it is about initial, intermediate and the impact. So focus more on the impact as opposed to the final outcome, because that could just be a mirage we never quite get to. A question, bit of foregrounding information, but the money shot really is, we don't want public servants to get caught in the middle of either falling short of their mandate or exceeding their resources. How can they best engage with agencies, and how is it best to present findings to the public? I'm happy to start wherever. This is like an auction. So it's getting the balance right. Not going too soft, not going too hard. It's a Goldilocks regulation principle really we're talking about. And how do you report against that?
It's a really hard balance. What comes to my mind is, and again, I'm an examples person. I think examples best demonstrate what we're saying here. The Labour Hire Licence, I'm now Labour Hire Licence Commissioner, and I was recently appointed in this role, and the scheme was introduced in the ACT on the basis that there are around 250 agencies that would apply for a licence. In the first year, which we've just started the renewal process, we have already issued over 800 licences. So it has been extremely difficult for us to balance the books. And I'm pleased to say that we've been able to do that by utilising a number of our work health and safety staff to also contribute to the running of that scheme. But I must admit that the payoff has been not being able to conduct as much compliance in that area this year in order to work on issuing those licences.
Can I make a comment on it? So the question was sort of about reporting, and so I'll come to that. But I think it actually also goes to what you do as a regulator, and then report on it. So I've just been in the job for 5 years. I've just been reappointed, which I'm very pleased about. And
I think after that comment that I just made, I'm not going to be reappointed.
oh, right. Well, that perhaps is a performance measure. So well done. That's excellent. So when I arrived, you know, the regulator had been standing up for 5 years. My predecessor did a terrific job. They were mainly working at, you know, the bottom end of the, you know, the sort of compliance triangle, so education and so forth. And we were just, you know, beginning to sharpen up the approach. And we had a wonderful conversation with the Federal Police at that point in time, because, you know,
Sarcasm? Is that
no, absolutely not. It was a wonderful conversation. We work closely with the Federal Police now, and, you know, do warrants and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. And we put people in jail, just by the way. So the conversation was, well, how do we stop fraud, right? Because, you know, back in those days there was fraud going on in solar panel installations and so forth. Quite hard to detect. And it was Peter Cozier who was the Deputy Commissioner, and he said, you know, you can't prosecute your way out of fraud, right? I mean, it's an economic activity, basically, and, you know, you can't prosecute enough, and the penalties, so do something, you know, that's not the way to do it. And so, you know, we extended the conversation, and we came up with a three-layered sort of enforcement posture. The first one of which was stop the harm, right? If you see it, right, there are all sorts of ways that you can stop it without waiting around to gather evidence for years and then prosecute. The second one, tremendously important, second one was break the business model, right? Because it's a business activity, fraud. So set up the way you regulate and what you're monitoring for and looking for in a way that makes it more obvious when it's happening. So you work on your detection rate. And then thirdly, prosecute when you can, right? I mean, you just have to do that, otherwise you're not taken seriously. And then to underline all of that, you can't just sort of sit inside your regulator and think about it. You've got to tell everybody. And so we regularly put out a compliance update, which goes out and it gets read really quite widely in the community.
And that's
the reporting
published.
bit.
That's publish and persuade. I'd say, in agreement with the two other panellists, whatever the compliance model is that you apply in your regulation, it needs something off to the side of it about who you're dealing with. You know, back in the day in the late 90s, Valerie and John Braithwaite from ANU developed a compliance framework. Everyone's flogged it and amended it. There was a model off to the side of it that people forget, which was shorthanded the BICEP model. And what it did is said, know the businesses, know the individuals, know their social factors, know their environmental factors, and know the people, because there will be leaders in it. And so if you break down the market segments that you're dealing with into some quite granular ways, analyse them, it tells you which lever to pull if you have to break a business model or you have to do something quite interfering, quite regulatory. that you've got a really good understanding of that market that you're regulating, and not just who they are, what drives them. What's driving them? Because most regulation affects economic activity. It's basically saying to people, if you want to be in this market, you have to meet these things. And we're going to keep people out of that market because we don't believe they behave the way we want the market to behave. So know them, segment them, understand them, collect the data on your activities and apply it back to those segments and what is it telling you? And then you'll be in a much better position to do that reporting out, whether it's press releases or doorstops, whatever the thing is. But also in your performance reporting to say, we hit this hard this year. We've changed the dynamic in that market through that activity in our regulation.
Yeah. So in my shop, picking up that to know who they are and what they're doing and why, I map that into our posture statement about being commercially savvy, right? Because we're in a commercial world. It's not being commercially sympathetic at all. In fact, if you know who you are working with, you are much less likely to be captured, because then you'll know why they are saying things to you, and perhaps even more importantly, what they are not saying. And then that helps to close that information asymmetry, that gap. Yeah.
There's a nice case study if you want to look at sort of the history of ASIC over time. And ASIC got to a point about 3 years ago where their mantra was litigate, litigate, litigate. Because in their powers, what they'd done is a lot of stakeholder work. But what they hadn't been doing was pulling the big card when they saw the stuff that they needed to pull it on, and their then chair said litigate, litigate, litigate. I think it's a bad look for a regulator to have to get to that point where you're not seeing across your market what are the tools that you can use to intervene with poor behaviour.
So I think this is where I might want to bring you back in, Veronica, because what I'm hearing, David has been reappointed and he graciously said his predecessor set the groundwork. So what the first CEO at CER had to do was different to what David's doing now, and it'll be different to what the replacement when David moves on.
And different to my replacement too.
Next week, yes. So this is about regulatory posture. So there's a question there about what are your sort of insights about how regulators' posture has changed and what are some of the drivers? And I think it does also link to a question, there was a question about other than the ATO, what other agencies spring to mind in terms of good practice in assessing the effectiveness of achieving outcomes? So a bit of a dual question there. Could you give us some thoughts on regulatory posture, the good, the bad and the ugly, and anyone else other than the ATO who really does do that segmenting well?
Yeah, those are great questions. I completely agree with your observations, David. I think that something else that is important in thinking about the regulator's posture is the degree to which they continue to build trust. And this is tricky because you want to be credible, but you also want to be trusted. And so there's a continuous cycle of, in a sense, recommunicating your mission, the telegraphing the and committing to the way in which you're going to behave, and signalling hard that you're going to be fair and responsive and in a listening posture without being captured. And the ATO over the years has done that particularly well. They've been very straightforward about what their targets are going to be on a rolling basis, but they've also worked hard at their communications, making them open, friendly, and making communicating with everyone at every level fairly easy. So that part is good, and we've got good models there. And you could argue that the ACCC is also fairly effective at that as well. The piece that I think we sometimes don't focus on enough when we're thinking about regulatory postures is, as Rona pointed out, the motivations of the people that we're working with and how those differ, but also the differential impact of what we're doing. So as well as segmenting markets by sector and by size of actor, I think we need to give a little bit more thought to segmenting by level of experience and by demographic factors, ethnicity, language, different socioeconomic situations. And I think that's something that COVID demonstrated very clearly. We're now talking about postcode poverty, but we also saw that a universal rule, like a lockdown, could have devastating impacts on people and businesses, depending on where they were located and depending on what level of resources they had. So as we talk about regulatory postures and communication, I think we now need to be thinking a lot harder about how many channels we need to be communicating on and to what range of differently situated individuals and organisations. So that makes it much more complicated. But the benefit of doing that is that you're going to be building the trust, which is where we started the conversation.
So I'm going to just jump on that word trust, because what you can't see, because you're looking at me, Veronica, and there's people walking around who are doing the filming, is I'm being regulated, and the 6-minute sign has come up. So what I'm now going to have to do is come from you back this way for your last sort of 30-second pitch to the camera. If people are busy eating their lunch while they're watching this, what's one thing that they're going to take away from the 4 Ps, and why a national regulators community practice generally is important, and why a localised chapter can really help people leverage and learn?
Know what you're doing and prove what you're doing. Be able to measure it, and partner with other professionals to help you through.
Partnership was going to be my my P as well. I think partnership. We have so many opportunities in the ACT to connect with a whole range of regulators from a Commonwealth perspective and ACT regulators, and that's why I think this the ACT NRCoP chapter is going to be really important and really beneficial for us. Partnership and professional.
Always be guided by the regulations, because when you are dealing with stakeholders, you will be able to justify your decisions in your regulations.
So I think about purpose, right? All the time. Sometimes the law just doesn't keep up with innovations in society. That can put you in a sort of a difficult position. So when you're thinking, be prepared to change your interpretation of the law if you can, right? If it's open on the law, to achieve a purpose. Because sometimes if you're stuck, right? I mean, we know that we're all responsible to Parliament, but sometimes if you're stuck, Parliament's not going to deal with the issue. They're just not. It's too far down. But it actually affects real people's lives. So, actually understand that, that regulation is about achieving an outcome. It's not just making a decision.
Wow, that was wonderful. I've had the privilege in the week leading up to this to have 25, 30 minutes with each one of these panellists, and easily we could have done an hour on each of their topics. I think the importance of this discussion is the 4 Ps, so policy, practice, professionalism and performance, are absolutely critical in their own right, and we need to focus on them at different times. They will have their day in the sun, but they clearly interanimate with each other to such a strong extent that if you ignore or undervalue any one of those for too long, it's going to come back to bite you. So that would be sort of my observation, and I've got lots of P's to sort of try to alliterate into some sort of clever academic article. I like, probably in the theme of the National Regulators Community Practice, I'm sticking to C's at the moment, about being a capable, competent, credible and consistent regulator. So that's my alliteration contribution to today. But unfortunately, that is all that we have time for today. These hours run down really, really quickly. So thank you again to our panellists. Thank you to our audience online and in person. As per normal, you will receive an email evaluation. We do look at them. We really look at them in terms of speakers, topics, timings, and forums, because it has to make a difference. If this doesn't work for you, it's going to die on the vine. So it's here to support you. And on that, advertising for the next event, which is coming up on the 21st of June, 12 until 1 p.m. I'll have to read this because it's got quite a long topic, but it's about setting regulatory practice at the speed of a pandemic, upcycling other regulators' tools and approaches to avoid reinventing the wheel. So I think that's pretty well came through what we just spoke about there. So please make sure you join ANZOG's socials, that is LinkedIn and Twitter, and look at their website. This will be uploaded on the website, the recording of this, in about 2 weeks' time. And I suppose finally, so I would like to thank you all for joining us today, and it really is an important milestone for the ACT. There's lots of people for lots of years who've had a few false starts about getting our own chapter. Doris has been at the front of it. She's found a sponsor in David Price, and we've got some clever people who will form the nucleus of that. So that's where we are. Until we see you next time, thank you all, stay safe, and goodbye.